I remember that night as if it were yesterday. The fire was crackling in the hearth, and the storm outside rattled the windows of my old house. 30 years on the force, and I still find myself replaying certain cases in my mind, the ones that never quite let you go. People often imagine detectives lose sleep over the bloodiest crimes. That's not true. It's the quiet ones, the subtle ones, the ones where nothing seems out of place. Those are the cases that haunt you. This story, well, it began like a dozen others. A phone call late in the evening. A missing person. A respectable man in a respectable neighborhood. His wife insisted it was unlike him to disappear without a word. His colleagues swore he was loyal, punctual, predictable. I thought it would be routine. Write the report, track his steps, find him at a bar or on a business trip he'd forgotten to mention. But something about her voice on the phone, that tremor, that pause, made me pay attention. And as I sat across from her the next morning, watching her stir her tea 3 times clockwise before setting the spoon down just so, I realized
next morning the storm had passed, leaving
this
the
was
streets
no
washed and
ordinary
shining. I arrived at their townhouse just after 8. Respectable brick facade, tidy curtains, a touch of ivy curling around the doorway. The sort of place where nothing dramatic is ever meant to happen. She greeted me in a pale blue housecoat, her hair pinned neatly, as though she'd been preparing for visitors all her life. Mrs. Whitmore, she said her name was. Her hand trembled only slightly as she motioned me inside. The drawing room smelled faintly of lavender polish. On the mantel were 2 porcelain figurines, a pair, a man and woman in 18th century dress. She caught me looking and explained, almost apologetically. They were a wedding gift. He hated them, said they stared at him. I let the silence sit for a moment before I asked about her husband. Mr. Whitmore, a banker of sorts. No enemies she knew of, a creature of habit. Always home by 6:30, dinner at 7 sharp, bed by 10. It was then that the daughter appeared, young, perhaps 18, with eyes too sharp for her age. She didn't curtsy or smile, just looked at me, measuring. You won't find him, she said flatly, before her mother hushed her and sent her upstairs. A family of routine, a wife who polishes her teaspoons until they gleam, a daughter who sees too much, and a man who vanishes without a trace. Even then I felt the weight of it. Cases like these never end the way you expect. I found myself at Whitmore and Company, a stately building with marble floors and the kind of hush that tells you money moves silently here. His colleagues received me with the polite stiffness one reserves for funerals and official visits. Mr. Whitmore? The manager, a round man with a pocket watch, nodded gravely. Dependable as they come. 30 years, never late. Clients adored him. Dependable, loyal, predictable. The same words his wife had used. When people repeat themselves so precisely, I start to wonder if they're quoting a script. I asked to see his office. Immaculate. Papers stacked, pens aligned, calendar marked down to the last detail. Almost too perfect, if you asked me. I ran a finger across the desk. No dust, no stray note. Only one thing caught my eye. A small photograph tucked behind the lamp. Not his wife, not his daughter. A young man, no more than 25, with a careless grin. I slipped it back without comment. A detective learns patience. You don't shout about what you see. You wait, and you listen. When I returned to the lobby, one of the clerks, a nervous fellow with ink-stained cuffs, leaned toward me. He left early the day he disappeared. Didn't say why. Just gathered his hat and coat and left before 4. That, in 30 years of punctuality, was the first crack in the glass. That photograph lingered in my mind all afternoon. A man like Whitmore, all rules, all routine, doesn't keep secret pictures without a reason.
I stopped by a little cafe across from the bank, the kind of place where clerks whisper over weak coffee. The young fellow in the photo wasn't hard to identify. His name was Daniel, an intern, in and out of the office for months. "Charming lad," the waitress said when I showed her the picture. "Came here often with Mr. Whitmore. They'd sit in the back corner, quiet-like. You wouldn't think much of it, just two gentlemen chatting, but always with that air of secrecy." Back at the Whitmore house, I casually mentioned the name over tea. Mrs. Whitmore's spoon clattered against her saucer, though she recovered quickly. "Daniel?" "Oh, one of Henry's trainees. Bright boy. My husband admired his potential." She smiled, but it was tight, like a ribbon pulled too sharply around a package. Upstairs, the daughter laughed when she overheard me. "Daniel? Father's little shadow, always hanging about. You'll find your answers with him, not here." It was then I realized. Every layer I peeled back only revealed more questions. And so, with evening pressing in and the lamplight flickering over my notes, I knew where I'd be heading next. Straight to Daniel.
Daniel lived in a narrow brick building on the east side, the kind with creaky stairs and neighbors who never look you in the eye. I found him on the third floor, shirt sleeves rolled up, ink smudges on his fingers, the mark of someone who worked hard or wanted to look as if he did. He opened the door wider than I expected, almost welcoming. "Detective Harris," he said smoothly, as if my arrival was no surprise. "I wondered how long it would take you to come knocking." That sort of greeting always makes my teeth itch. Too calm, too ready. The innocent rarely expect detectives. His room was modest but carefully arranged, books on finance, a half-finished letter on the desk, and tucked between two volumes, a silver cigarette case with initials that did not match his own. H.W. "Tell me about Mr. Whitmore," I asked, keeping my tone casual. Daniel leaned back in his chair, eyes sharp, a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "He was a mentor. Generous, demanding, sometimes too demanding. People like him don't simply disappear, Detective. They choose to." There was something in the way he said it, not quite grief, not quite relief. I left his flat with more questions than answers, the weight of that cigarette case in my pocket. And as the evening fog rolled in, one thought circled in my mind. If Whitmore had chosen to disappear, what exactly had he been running from? The next morning I returned to the bank under the pretense of collecting routine documents. Clerks are creatures of habit. Ask the right questions and they'll hand you more than they realize. In Whitmore's drawer I found a small leather-bound ledger slipped between insurance files. It wasn't official bank property. No, this was personal. Columns of numbers, dates, initials, and among the neat handwriting, a series of discrete withdrawals, not large enough to cause alarm, but regular. Every payment led to the same set of initials, D.L. Daniel Lawrence. It could have been innocent, a loan, support for a student, but paired with that photograph, the cigarette case, and Daniel's peculiar calm, it smelled of something more. I closed the book carefully. Experience had taught me not to jump to conclusions. People aren't puzzles with only one solution. They're labyrinths with paths that lead nowhere. Back at the Whitmore house, I observed the wife as she poured my tea. She avoided my eyes as I set the ledger on the table between us. Her hand trembled just once before she pushed the cup toward me. "Detective," she said quietly, "some truths are better left untouched." And there it was, the first real crack in the facade. I stayed longer than politeness required. Mrs. Whitmore perched in her chair, her back as straight as the porcelain figurines on her mantel. She poured me tea, then poured herself a second cup she never touched.
Your husband cared for his routines, I said softly, letting the words hang. Except when he didn't. Except when there was Daniel. Her hand froze midway to her lips. The spoon clinked against the saucer, then rested still. You've read the ledger, she murmured, more statement than question. I didn't answer. Detectives know the power of silence. People rush to fill it. She straightened, composing herself. Henry was generous. Perhaps too generous. He believed in helping young men make their way, that is all. Her eyes flicked to the window, avoiding mine. Outside, the garden roses swayed in the wind. Then why the secrecy? Why hide the payments, the meetings? I pressed. For a moment, something in her face cracked. Grief, anger, or maybe fear. Then she smiled tightly, as if sewing her lips shut. Detective, she whispered, you think you understand, but you don't. Henry's disappearance is not Daniel's doing. It is mine. And with that, she rang the bell for the maid and ended our conversation. Her words followed me out of that house and all the way back to my study. It is mine. Not a slip of the tongue, too deliberate for that. No, it was a confession of sorts, though of what I couldn't yet tell. So I began to look at her, not as the grieving wife, but as a woman with a history. And in 30 years on the job, I've learned one rule above all. Everyone has a history. At Town Records, I found the file thin but suggestive. Before she was Mrs. Whitmore, she was Eleanor Price, daughter of a modest shopkeeper. She married Henry at 19. No scandals, no whispers, except for one curious note. In her early 20s, she had briefly petitioned for a separation. Never pursued, never finalized. Buried in the paperwork. But it was there. And then came the letter, slipped under my office door that same evening. No return address. Just a single sheet scrawled in hurried ink. She is not what she seems. Ask about the summer of 1912. The handwriting wasn't Henry's, nor Daniel's.
The archives smelled
Someone
of
else
dust
had
and secrets,
decided
as they
to join
always
the
do.
game. I requested the local papers from the summer of 1912, and the clerk brought me bound volumes, their edges yellowed and brittle. It didn't take long. By July, the Whitmores, then barely a year into their marriage, had been mentioned in the society columns. Garden parties, charitable luncheons, Henry the rising banker, and Eleanor the young beauty on his arm. Perfect. Too perfect. Then, in August, a short article tucked in the corner of page 6. Mysterious drowning at Whitmore Estate. A guest, unnamed in the initial report, had been pulled from the river that bordered the Whitmore property. Police had called it an accident. The man was said to be a close friend of the family. I cross-checked the coroner's report. The name was there, faint under the inkblot. Thomas Greer, 23 years old, bachelor. Last seen dining at the Whitmores. And then, silence. No follow-up, no questions. The whole affair vanished as if it had never happened. But in the margin of one record I found a note, unsigned. Ask Eleanor Price why she wept at the riverbank when no one was looking. 30 years on the job, and I've learned. Old secrets have long shadows.
Not many from that summer
And
were
Mrs.
still
Whitmore's
alive, but
shadow
the Whitmore's
stretched
old
further
gardener,
than I
Mr. Lyle, had outlived them all. A wiry man in his 80s with eyes like clouded glass, but a memory sharp as thorns. I found him in a small cottage on the edge of town, his hands still stained with earth. When I mentioned Eleanor Whitmore, his lips tightened. "Ah, Miss Price," he said, using her maiden name. "She was different then." Quick with a laugh. Too quick, some thought I asked about Thomas Greer.
For a moment Lyle's hands stopped moving. He set down his teacup, and in that pause I heard 30 years of silence crack. "He came often," Lyle whispered, "too often. Always when Mr. Whitmore was away on business. The river wasn't kind to him, but it wasn't the river that started it." My pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Lyle leaned closer, his voice a rasp. "I saw them one evening. By the roses near the riverbank, Miss Eleanor and young Greer, holding hands, arguing low like lovers do when love turns bitter. Then he stormed off. Next morning they said he'd drowned. He shook his head. But I tell you, detective, when I saw her weeping at the water's edge, it wasn't grief for a friend. It was the sorrow of someone who had lost far more." Lyle's cottage with the chill of his words clinging to me like the damp of river fog. 30 years of distance hadn't dimmed his memory, nor his conviction. But was it truth, or the imagination of an old man still haunted by the ghosts of his youth? I spread my notes on the desk by lamplight. Eleanor Price, Thomas Greer, a drowning, a weeping widow at the riverbank. If it had been love, it was forbidden. If it had been anger, it was dangerous. And if Henry Whitmore had known, well, then the story became something darker still. The letter returned to my thoughts. She is not what she seems. Was it pointing to an affair? A betrayal? Even a crime? Or was someone, even now, trying to smear her memory for their own gain? That night I couldn't sleep. I imagined Eleanor, barely 21, trapped between a powerful husband and a reckless young man who might have promised escape. I imagined whispered arguments, broken promises, footsteps by the water. But imagination is not proof, and proof was what I needed. So the next morning I resolved to find one more voice from that summer, a neighbor, a guest, anyone who had seen what the official reports had chosen to forget. Her name was Clara Hensley, 80 now, frail but sharp, living in a narrow townhouse that smelled of lavender and old lace. When I mentioned the summer of 1912, her eyes flickered with something that was neither surprise nor confusion, but recognition. "You're not the first to come asking," she said softly, "but you may be the first I'll answer." She poured tea with trembling hands, then leaned back, her gaze wandering to some far-off August evening. I was 17 that summer. Our families knew the Whitmores well enough. Eleanor, oh, she was beautiful. I admired her, envied her. But I also pitied her, though I didn't know why at the time. I asked about Thomas Greer. Clara's lips tightened. He was dashing, full of charm. Everyone noticed how often he came to call. But what most people didn't see was how Henry looked at him. Sharp, cold. He knew. Husbands always know. Her voice dropped. The night before Mr. Greer drowned, I couldn't sleep. I slipped onto our balcony for air. From there I saw the Whitmore's lawn, the lamps glowing faint. And I swear to you, detective, I saw 3 figures by the river. Eleanor, Greer, and Henry. She paused, eyes wet now. There was shouting, muffled by the water. Then Henry's hand on Greer's shoulder, firm, like a warning. And Eleanor, she was crying. That was the last time I saw Mr. Greer alive. Clara looked at me, her voice trembling. They called it an accident, but I've never believed it. Whitmore State loomed as it always did, all grandeur and silence. as if the house itself conspired to keep its secrets. When Mrs. Whitmore received me in the drawing room, her composure was impeccable. Black silk, pearls at her throat, a calm that bordered on defiance. I didn't waste time. 30 years of detective work had taught me when to be patient and when to strike. "Mrs. Whitmore," I said, laying my notes on the polished table, "you told me Henry's possessions were yours. And perhaps you were right. But what of Thomas Greer? Was he yours too?" For the first time her eyes flickered. Just for a moment the calm cracked. "You dig in graves, detective," she said coldly, "and all you find is dust." "Clara Hensley remembers more than dust," I replied evenly. "She saw you, Mr. Greer, and your husband by the river that night. She heard the shouting." Her hand tightened on the armrest. Silence stretched between us like a taut rope. Then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered, "I tried to stop them." Her words hung in the air, heavy as smoke. Not a confession, not yet, but not innocence either. She rose, her figure tall and proud against the flicker of the firelight. "You think you can judge what happened 30 years ago? You weren't there, detective. You don't know what it meant to be a wife in this house." And with that she swept from the room, leaving me with more answers than I'd come for. That night, but even more long questions. After Mrs. Whitmore had retreated upstairs, I lingered in the drawing room. A detective learns to listen, not just to people, but to houses. The way doors stick, the way floorboards groan. This house wanted to be heard. I drifted into Henry's old study, a room untouched, as if time itself had stopped the day he died. Books lined the shelves, heavy tomes of law and finance. The desk stood polished, its drawers locked. But locks, to a man in my line of work, are merely invitations. In the bottom drawer, beneath stale ledgers and ink-stained blotters, I found it. An envelope, yellowed but intact, addressed in a neat, youthful hand, Eleanor. I slid the letter free. The ink had faded, but the words still burned. "If he ever discovers us, we must run. Meet me by the river tomorrow night. I cannot endure this lie any longer." It was signed simply, T.G. My heart slowed, heavy with the weight of 30 silent years. The drowning, the arguments, the weeping widow, it all circled back to this fragile scrap of paper. But one question cut sharper than the rest. Had Henry Whitmore found this letter before I did? I sat by the Whitmore's hearth, the letter trembling in my hand. Firelight danced across the ink as if eager to consume the last trace of Thomas Greer. Pieces fit together, but too neatly. Eleanor and Greer, lovers, or dreamers of escape. Henry, proud and ruthless, catching wind of betrayal. A confrontation by the river, a body pulled from the water. An accident, or a reckoning. When Eleanor entered, I held the letter out. For the first time, her mask slipped. Not anger, not even fear, just a deep, weary sadness. She took it gently, looked at it a long while, then held it toward the flames. "This should have burned 30 years ago," she murmured. I didn't stop her. Some truths are too heavy to drag into the present. The paper curled, blackened, and vanished into ash. "Detective," she said quietly, "do you believe me guilty?" I met her gaze. 30 years on the job, and I'd learned that guilt is rarely simple. "I believe you lived a life no one else will ever fully understand," I answered. She smiled faintly, turned away, and left me with the fire and its secrets. And so the case of Eleanor Whitmore was never solved, not in the courts, not in the papers, and not in my own mind. But some stories aren't meant for verdicts. They're meant to haunt. I poured myself a glass, leaned back, and let the crackle of the flames remind me why this was the case. I never forgot.